She was forced by her family to marry her sister's millionaire fiancé. In Coma, unbelievable happened. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's begin the story. Asterisk. The air was thick with tension as Claire Thompson stared at the letter in her hands. It was her family's decision, not hers. Her mother had insisted she marry her sister's fiancé, Alexander Ford, who was lying in a coma in the hospital. Claire's heart raced as she struggled to understand the reasoning behind this forced union. She wasn't prepared for this, wasn't ready to step into her sister's shoes. But there was no escaping it. Her family needed the Ford family's wealth to maintain their status and the debts they had accumulated over the years. Her sister, who had been engaged to Alexander for 2 years, was out of the picture, tragically taken away in a car accident. With her sister gone, her family saw only one option to keep the wealth and security they had come to depend on Claire. "This is the only way," her mother had told her with a cold, firm voice. "You need to marry Alexander and save this family from financial ruin." Claire had tried to protest, tried to explain that this wasn't right, but her words fell on deaf ears. The decision had been made. She was expected to marry a man who was barely conscious, who had no idea what was happening, and she had no choice but to go along with it. The hospital room was sterile and quiet, except for the constant beep of the machines that monitored Alexander's vital signs. Claire stood at the edge of his bed, gazing at the man she had never met, let alone loved. He was young, maybe in his early 30s, with dark, tousled hair and a strong jawline, but all of that didn't matter now. What mattered was the contract her family had made, and the reality that she had no choice but to honor it. The wedding would take place soon as the doctors cleared him to attend. Claire had never imagined her life would come to this, a marriage based on obligation, not love. As she stood there, watching Alexander's chest rise and fall with each breath, she couldn't help but wonder what would happen after the wedding. Would he wake up and find out the truth? Or would he remain in a coma forever, leaving her trapped in a marriage of silence and deception? She turned her head, looking away from Alexander's pale face, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. She felt suffocated, her world shrinking with each passing second. Was this really the life she had ahead of her? A life of pretending? But in that moment, as she stood there in the quiet, cold room, Claire knew one thing for sure: her life was about to change forever, whether she was ready for it or not. The days following the decision to marry Alexander were a blur for Claire. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions, each one more chaotic than the last. Her family's pressure weighed heavily on her chest, but there was little room for negotiation. She tried to convince herself that she was doing the right thing, that this was for the good of the family, that she could endure this for a few months, maybe even a year. But as the wedding day drew closer, the reality of the situation felt even more suffocating. She hadn't even met Alexander properly, and now she was expected to marry him. Not out of love, but because of an agreement. Claire stood in front of her mirror, the reflection staring back at her with an almost haunting emptiness. Her dress was simple, but still elegant, chosen by her mother, of course. There were no choices to be made. It wasn't her wedding. It was a transaction, a means to an end. The thought of exchanging vows with a man who didn't even know her name seemed absurd, yet there she was, preparing for it. The night before the wedding, Claire couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned in bed, the sheets tangled around her legs as her thoughts raced. She thought about her sister, who had been taken so suddenly, leaving behind a fiancé who now lay in a coma. She had never thought much about Alexander before. All she knew was that he was a successful businessman, wealthy, and someone her sister had planned to marry. Now, he was lying in a hospital bed, his future uncertain. And yet Claire was supposed to take his place. She stared out the window, the night sky dark and quiet, a stark contrast to the storm of emotions brewing inside her. A sudden knock on her door startled her, and her mother entered, her face set in that same stern expression that Claire had grown accustomed to. "It's time, Claire," her mother said softly. "You need to be ready for tomorrow." The words were simple, but they carried an unspoken weight. Claire nodded, though she wasn't sure if she could go through with it. She didn't have a choice, she reminded herself. There was nothing left for her to do but follow through. The wedding the next day was quiet, almost too quiet. Only close family members were present, and the ceremony itself felt like a formality. Alexander remained unconscious in the hospital, and his lawyer stood in for him during the vows. Claire could barely look at him, let alone imagine a future with him. As they exchanged rings and signed the papers, Claire felt like she was signing away her future. She was a prisoner in a contract that she never agreed to, but there was no turning back now. The ceremony ended quickly, and Claire found herself in the back of a car, heading to the mansion that would be her new home. The mansion was vast, the kind of place she had only seen in magazines, and it felt cold, almost lifeless. She couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't belong there. The housekeeper showed her to a room that was far grander than anything she had ever seen, but it felt more like a cage than a sanctuary. The bed was massive, the curtains heavy and dark. Everything about the room screamed wealth, but there was no warmth, no love. It was just a place where a woman could be locked away in a gilded cage. Claire sat down on the edge of the bed, the silence of the room pressing in on her. She wanted to cry, but the tears wouldn't come. She had made her decision, and now she had to live with it. The thought of Alexander, unconscious and unaware of everything, made her stomach turn. What if he woke up? What would he think when he found out that the woman he was supposed to marry wasn't his true love, but his fiancé's sister? The thought was too much to bear. Claire closed her eyes, trying to push the thoughts away, but they lingered, swirling in her mind like a storm. She had no idea what the future held, but she knew that whatever it was, it would be nothing like the life she had imagined for herself. The following days felt like a blur for Claire. Every morning, she woke up in a bed larger than anything she had ever known. In a house so grand it seemed more like a museum than a home. The silence in the mansion was deafening, with only the occasional sound of the housekeeper or the staff moving through the hallways. Despite the luxury that surrounded her, Claire felt emptier than ever before. She walked through the halls, her footsteps echoing, wondering how long it would be before she lost her mind in this gilded cage. Every corner of the house felt cold, every piece of furniture too pristine to touch. She had never felt more out of place in her life. The life she had known was far from perfect, but it was hers. Now, everything had changed. She wasn't sure what to do with herself. She tried to keep herself busy, but the mansion felt like an endless maze, and she was just a ghost wandering through it. Days turned into weeks, and still, no word came from Alexander. He remained in a coma, trapped in a world of unconsciousness while she lived out her own nightmare. Claire spent most of her time in her room, trying to distract herself with books or sketching, but nothing could erase the gnawing feeling of guilt that ate away at her. She wasn't sure what had been worse, the wedding or the days that followed. At least during the ceremony, there had been a sense of finality, a sense of closure, even if it was for something she hadn't chosen. Now, all she had was uncertainty. The mansion felt more like a prison with each passing day. She couldn't bring herself to leave it, though. Her family's words echoed in her mind, reminding her that she had to stay. The money, the status, the future, all of it depended on her staying and keeping up the charade. But how long could she keep this up? She wondered what her life would have been like if she had never agreed to this in the first place. Would she have been happy? Would she have had the chance to find love on her own terms? It seemed like a distant dream now, one she had sacrificed for the sake of her family's future. As Claire sat by the window one evening, looking out over the manicured gardens, she thought back to the life she had left behind. She missed the simple things, the noise of the city, the feeling of freedom, the company of people who didn't judge her by the wealth of her family. She missed the life where she had choices, where she had a future she could control. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway snapped Claire out of her thoughts. She turned her head, wondering who it could be. The staff didn't come this late, and she hadn't expected any visitors. The door opened, and a man stepped inside. He was tall, dressed in a dark suit, his expression serious as he walked toward her. It was the first time anyone had come to see her in weeks. "Mrs. Ford," the man said, his voice cold and formal. "I'm here on behalf of the Ford family. There are matters that need to be discussed regarding your marriage to Mr. Ford." Claire stood up, her heart racing. The mention of her marriage sent a jolt of panic through her. She had hoped that maybe, just maybe, she could remain unnoticed, that she could live in this mansion and simply survive without having to face the reality of her situation. But now, it seemed that the world was catching up to her, and she was being forced to confront the consequences of her decision. She nodded slowly, not sure what to expect, but knowing deep down that it would only make things harder. "Follow me," the man said, turning on his heel and walking toward the door. Claire hesitated for a moment before following him, her mind racing with questions. What was going on? Why was someone from the Ford family here now? She had no idea what to expect, but she knew that whatever it was, it would change everything. As Claire followed the man down the long, silent corridor of the mansion, a sense of dread settled over her. The last few weeks had been a haze of empty rooms, luxurious meals, and endless loneliness. She had tried to convince herself that she could manage this life, that it was temporary, but deep down, she knew the truth: this wasn't going to change anytime soon. The man led her to a small, quiet office near the back of the house. It was a sharp contrast to the grandeur of the rest of the mansion, simple and sterile, with only a few leather chairs and a desk. The man gestured for her to sit, then took his place across from her, opening a folder in front of him. "Mrs. Ford," he began, his voice firm yet neutral. "There are a few matters that need to be addressed regarding your marriage to Mr. Ford." Claire's heart skipped a beat. She had known this moment would come when someone would finally demand her attention, force her to confront the reality of the situation. But the words still felt like a punch in the gut. "What matters?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "As you know, your marriage to Mr. Ford was not a traditional one. It was arranged under unique circumstances, and now we need to discuss the next steps." The man's words felt distant, almost like he was speaking in a language Claire could barely understand. He continued to explain the details, but Claire's mind was racing. All she could think about was the fact that Alexander, the man she was supposed to marry, was still in a coma. He had no idea that she was sitting here, discussing their future as if he were already awake, already in control of his life. The man in front of her seemed to sense her confusion. "I understand this is not what you expected, but the Ford family has certain obligations. Your marriage is part of that legacy, and as long as Mr. Ford remains in his current condition, you will be expected to uphold that legacy." Claire's head spun. She had heard the words before: legacy, obligation, duty. But hearing them out loud, in this cold office, made her realize just how trapped she was. This wasn't a choice for her. She wasn't part of a love story, she was part of a business arrangement. She tried to gather her thoughts, trying to focus on what the man was saying. "What exactly does that mean for me?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "It means," he replied, "that your role as Mrs. Ford will be expected in full, regardless of your personal feelings. You will attend the necessary events, represent the family, and fulfill the duties of your position until Mr. Ford regains consciousness, or until further decisions are made." Claire's stomach twisted. The idea of attending events as his wife, of pretending to be a part of something she wasn't, felt suffocating. She had never asked for this life, never wanted to be trapped in a role that wasn't hers. But as the man spoke, her mind began to churn. What if she didn't comply? What would happen then? She looked at the man, her heart racing. "And if I refuse?" she asked quietly. The man's expression remained unchanged, but there was a coldness in his eyes that sent a chill down her spine. "I believe you know the answer to that, Mrs. Ford. This marriage is not just about you and Mr. Ford. It's about the family, about the legacy that must be preserved." Claire's breath caught in her throat. She felt a pang of helplessness. There was no escape from this. The weight of her family's expectations, the pressure to maintain appearances, pressed down on her like an unrelenting force. She wanted to scream, to run away from all of this, but she knew she couldn't. "Not now." The man stood up, closing the folder with a snap. "I trust you understand the gravity of this situation," he said coldly. "Your cooperation is essential." Claire nodded, though she wasn't sure she fully understood what that cooperation would cost her. As she left the office, her mind was spinning with all that had been said. She had no choice but to play the role that had been assigned to her. But deep down, she knew that this life of pretending, of fulfilling duties she never asked for, was slowly breaking her. She wasn't sure how much longer she could go on living this lie. The days after Claire's meeting with the man from the Ford family blurred together in a haze of obligations and appearances. Each day felt like a repeat of the last, an endless cycle of pretending, of fulfilling duties she never asked for. Claire had become a master at hiding her true feelings, at playing the role she was expected to play, but inside, she felt hollow. She spent her days in the mansion, attending meetings with the staff, dealing with the paperwork, and occasionally attending social events. She had been taught how to act, how to smile, how to walk in heels that felt too high, and how to speak in a voice that never wavered. Yet no matter how much she forced herself to blend in, she could never escape the overwhelming feeling that she was living someone else's life. The mansion was empty, despite its size. There was no warmth, no laughter, and no love. Only the cold, imposing walls of the house and the distant echo of footsteps in the hallways. Alexander's room, where he lay in a coma, was just down the corridor from hers, and Claire often found herself staring at his door. It was as if she could feel the weight of the situation every time she passed by. A man who was supposed to be her husband, yet he was unconscious, lying in a bed in another world, while she lived out a life that felt like a dream, or rather, a nightmare. She didn't even know if she could call it a marriage. There were no shared moments, no love, and certainly no intimacy. It was just a hollow promise, a transaction that had been made long before she had any say in the matter. But as the days turned into weeks, Claire began to notice something strange happening. There was a subtle shift in the atmosphere around her. The staff seemed more nervous, more on edge. They avoided her gaze when she walked into rooms and spoke in hushed tones when they thought she wasn't listening. Something was off, and Claire couldn't shake the feeling that it had something to do with Alexander's condition. One evening, after another lonely dinner in the grand dining room, Claire sat alone in the library, flicking through a book she wasn't really reading. The silence around her was deafening, and she longed for someone to talk to, someone who could understand what she was going through. Just then, the door creaked open, and Claire turned to see a figure standing in the doorway. It was one of the house staff, a young woman named Elizabeth, who had been working in the mansion for years. Elizabeth was one of the few people who had spoken to Claire without a trace of fear in her eyes. She had always been kind to her, and for that, Claire appreciated her presence more than she realized. "Mrs. Ford," Elizabeth said softly, stepping into the room. "There's something you need to know." Claire's heart skipped a beat. The urgency in Elizabeth's voice caught her off guard. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Elizabeth hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "It's about Mr. Ford. There's been a change in his condition." Claire's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't heard any news about Alexander's health in days, and the idea that something had changed made her both hopeful and terrified at the same time. "What do you mean?" Claire asked, standing up from her seat. Elizabeth looked around nervously, ensuring no one else was in the room before continuing. "He's starting to wake up, slowly, but he's showing signs of consciousness." The words hit Claire like a bolt of lightning. Alexander, the man she was forced to marry, was finally waking up. The thought was almost too much to process. "When?" Claire asked, her voice trembling. "He's still very weak," Elizabeth replied. "The doctors say it could take time before he's fully awake, but it's a good sign." Claire nodded slowly, trying to process the news. She had no idea what this would mean for her life. Would Alexander remember the arrangements made for their marriage? Would he want to continue it? She had no answers, only more questions. The idea that Alexander might wake up was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, it meant that her life could finally return to normal. On the other hand, it meant that the truth would come out that he would know everything, that she had been forced into a life that wasn't hers. Claire stood there, feeling the weight of the news settle in her chest. Her heart raced, and her mind swirled with 1,000 thoughts. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment when everything could change. But she had no idea if she was ready for what came next. The news about Alexander waking up spread quickly, but Claire couldn't shake the feeling of uncertainty that gripped her heart. She had been forced into this life, a life she never wanted, and now the very man she had married out of obligation, not love, was starting to regain consciousness. She couldn't help but wonder what it would mean for her, for them. Would he remember what had happened? Would he be angry, or worse, disappointed. Claire knew she wasn't ready to face him, to confront the reality of her forced marriage. Every part of her wanted to run, to escape from the weight of it all. But deep down, she knew she couldn't. She had made a promise, albeit unwillingly, to uphold the Ford family's legacy. Her role in that legacy had already been sealed. The days that followed were filled with anticipation and dread. Claire spent her time wandering through the mansion, lost in her thoughts. She knew the moment would come when she had to face Alexander, but she dreaded it. What would she say? What could she say to someone who had been unconscious for so long, unaware of the life he was being pulled into? The thought made her stomach turn. Her world had been turned upside down in a matter of days. No longer could she hide in the shadows, pretending that everything was fine. She had been living a lie, and now that lie was about to be exposed. One afternoon, as Claire was sitting by the window, she heard footsteps approaching. It was the sound she had grown used to, footsteps that signaled the arrival of someone important, someone who had the power to change the course of her life. The door to her room opened, and a man stepped inside. It was one of the doctors who had been overseeing Alexander's care. He was calm, but there was something in his eyes that made Claire's heart race. "Mrs. Ford," the doctor began, his tone respectful but serious. "Mr. Ford is awake. He's been asking for you." Claire's breath caught in her throat. She had expected this moment, but now that it was here, she wasn't sure if she was ready. "What did he say?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The doctor hesitated for a moment before answering. "He's still disoriented, but he remembers you. He's asking about the wedding, about his family. He's asking questions, Mrs. Ford. Questions you might not be ready to answer." The words hit Claire like a punch in the stomach. Alexander knew. He remembered. The reality of her situation had just become impossible to ignore. "I'll go to him," Claire said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. The doctor nodded and led her down the long hallway to Alexander's room. As they approached the door, Claire's heart pounded in her chest. She hadn't seen him since the wedding, and now, here he was, awake and waiting for her. The door creaked open, and Claire stepped inside. Alexander was lying in bed, his face pale but alert. His eyes locked onto hers as she entered, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. There was so much to say, but neither of them knew where to begin. "Claire," Alexander's voice was hoarse, but it was unmistakable. I remember the wedding. I remember everything." Claire's throat tightened. She had no idea what he had remembered or how much he truly understood. "I'm here," she said quietly, her voice betraying the unease she felt. Alexander's gaze softened, but there was confusion in his eyes. "Why are you here? Why are you—" He stopped, his mind racing to piece together the puzzle of the past few weeks. Claire didn't know how to answer him. How could she explain everything that had happened? The pressure, the expectations, the marriage that wasn't hers to make? She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. She had been so focused on surviving this marriage that she had never thought about how to explain it to him. "I don't know what to say," Claire finally whispered. "I never wanted this. I never wanted any of this." Alexander reached for her hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "I don't understand," he said, his voice filled with pain. "Why didn't you tell me? Why did you agree to this?" Claire's eyes filled with tears as she looked at him. "I didn't have a choice," she said softly. "It was never my choice." The weight of her words hung in the air, and for the first time, Claire felt the full weight of her situation. She had been trapped in a web of obligation, and now, she was being forced to confront the consequences of her decisions. Alexander seemed to process her words slowly, his eyes narrowing as he tried to make sense of everything. "But why?" he asked again. "Why did they force you into this?" Claire sighed, her heart heavy. "Because my family needed this. They needed the connection to the Ford family. They needed the wealth, the status. And they forced me into this marriage. I never had a say in it." Silence settled between them. It was a silence filled with unspoken questions, with confusion and regret. Claire had never expected her life to take such a turn. But now, as she stood there beside Alexander's bed, she realized that there was no going back. The life she had known was gone, and now she had to figure out how to move forward. The silence between Claire and Alexander lingered in the air. thick with unspoken words and emotions that neither of them knew how to express. After everything that had happened, Claire wasn't sure where to begin. The truth felt too heavy, and she wasn't sure if she was ready to share it all with him. Alexander was awake, finally, and his memories seemed to be flooding back. But he was still disoriented, trying to understand what had happened to him, to them. She looked at him, her heart aching with the weight of the situation. "You didn't deserve any of this," Alexander said softly, breaking the silence. His voice was hoarse, but there was a softness to it that made Claire's chest tighten. "I didn't know you were forced into this." His eyes searched hers, full of pain and confusion. "Why didn't you tell me?" Claire hesitated, her mind racing. She wanted to tell him everything, but she knew it wasn't that simple. "Because I didn't know how," she finally whispered. "I didn't know how to tell you, and I didn't know if I could." Alexander's expression softened, his hand reaching out for hers. "But I'm awake now, Claire. We can figure this out together. We'll make it right." His words filled her with a strange mixture of hope and fear. Hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way out of the mess her family had created, but fear that it might be too late. "You don't have to do this," Alexander continued, his grip tightening around her hand. "You never had to marry me. You should have been free to make your own choices, Claire. No one should have forced you into this." The guilt that had been gnawing at Claire's heart began to grow, but she quickly suppressed it. She had no control over what had happened. She had been trapped, suffocating under the expectations of her family. But now, with Alexander awake, and with him holding her hand, there was a glimmer of hope that they could change things. "I never wanted any of this," Claire admitted, her voice trembling. "But now that you're awake, I don't know what to do. I don't know how to fix this." Alexander's gaze softened, and for the first time, he looked at her not as his wife by obligation, but as a woman. A person who had been caught in a whirlwind of circumstances beyond her control. "We'll figure it out," he said quietly. "We'll figure out a way to make things right, but it starts with honesty. We have to be honest with each other, Claire. About everything." Claire nodded slowly, the weight of his words sinking in. She had been living a lie, trapped in a web of deceit, and now she had a chance to rebuild, to live her life the way she had always wanted. But there were still so many unanswered questions. What would happen next? What would her family do when they found out that Alexander was awake? What would they think when they realized she had been living with the truth, hiding from them, pretending to be a wife when all she had was a name and a contract? "I don't know if I can keep up this charade anymore," Claire admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't know what's going to happen when they find out." Alexander looked at her with understanding in his eyes. "You don't have to keep pretending, Claire. We'll tell them the truth, and we'll deal with the consequences together. No more pretending." The relief that washed over Claire was overwhelming. For the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of freedom, a glimmer of control over her own life. She wasn't alone in this anymore. With Alexander awake, they could face the future together, even if it meant confronting the very people who had forced her into this marriage in the first place. "Thank you," Claire whispered, squeezing his hand. "Thank you for believing in me." Alexander smiled softly. "You deserve to be happy, Claire. We both do." For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Claire allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for a life she could finally call her own. But as she looked into Alexander's eyes, she knew that the journey ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be obstacles, people to face, and choices to be made. But at least now, they would face it together. The days following their conversation felt like a whirlwind for Claire. She had never imagined she would find herself in this position, standing by the man she had once been forced to marry, now awake, now questioning everything. As the days passed, Claire and Alexander spent time together in the mansion, talking, discussing, and slowly getting to know one another. The tension that had once filled the air seemed to dissipate, replaced by something new, something fragile, yet hopeful. But despite the growing bond between them, Claire knew the hardest part was yet to come. It wasn't just their relationship that needed fixing. It was everything else, the lies, the family, the expectations that had been placed on both of them. Claire knew that her family, the Ford family, would never accept the truth. They would never accept that Alexander was awake and had heard the real story. They would never accept that she wasn't going to play her part in their legacy any longer. Claire felt the weight of the truth pressed down on her. She had been living in a gilded cage for so long, pretending to be someone she wasn't, playing a role she hadn't chosen. But now, she had a choice. She could stand up for herself. She could finally tell her family the truth. But the fear was still there. She didn't know how they would react. Would they see her as a traitor? Would they abandon her? The way they had abandoned the version of her they had created? She didn't know. But one thing was certain, she couldn't keep living a lie. One afternoon, as Claire and Alexander were sitting in the drawing room, the air heavy with the unspoken thoughts of the last few weeks, a car pulled up to the mansion. It wasn't just any car. It was the car her mother always drove when she came to visit. The visit she had been dreading. Claire froze, her stomach twisting in knots. "It's time," she whispered. More to herself than to Alexander. Alexander looked at her, his expression soft but understanding. He knew this was coming. He had known it from the moment he woke up. This was the moment they would have to face her family, face the truth, and face the consequences of their actions. They had both been living in a world of uncertainty, and now it was time to confront it. Claire stood up, her legs feeling like lead as she made her way to the door. She had no idea what would happen once they opened it, but she knew it was time. Time to stop hiding, time to stop pretending. She opened the door to find her mother standing there, looking just as stern as ever. "Claire," her mother said, her voice clipped. "We need to talk." Claire nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. "Come in, Mother," she said quietly. As her mother stepped inside, Claire's thoughts raced. She had no idea what to expect. What would her mother say? What would her family think when they found out the truth? Claire had spent so many years trying to please them, trying to live up to their expectations. But now, everything had changed. She couldn't be the daughter they wanted her to be anymore. She couldn't be the pawn in their game. As her mother sat down across from her, Claire took a deep breath, steadying herself. It was time. "Mother," Claire began, her voice trembling, "I have something to tell you, something I should have said a long time ago." Her mother's eyes narrowed, her expression hardening. "What is it, Claire?" she asked sharply. "I'm not going to keep up this facade anymore," Claire said, the words coming out in a rush. "I'm not going to pretend to be someone I'm not. I didn't choose this marriage. I didn't want any of this. It was all a lie, and I can't live with that anymore." Her mother's face turned pale. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, her voice rising. "You married Alexander for the good of the family. You don't have the luxury of choice." "No, Mother," Claire said, her voice steady now. "I didn't marry Alexander for the good of the family. I married him because you forced me to. And now, I'm done. I won't live a life I didn't choose. I won't live a lie anymore." The room fell silent. Her mother stared at her, disbelief and anger flashing in her eyes. Claire stood her ground, her heart pounding in her chest. She had made her decision, and now there was no turning back. "You're being selfish, Claire," her mother said coldly. "You're throwing away everything we've worked for. You're throwing away your future." "My future?" Claire echoed, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "My future has always been your future. But not anymore. I'm done living my life for you. I'm going to live for me." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Claire had said what she needed to say. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but she knew one thing for sure. She was no longer afraid of her family's expectations. She was no longer afraid to stand up for herself. The silence between them stretched on, but this time, it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a silence filled with new possibilities, with new beginnings. Claire had finally taken control of her own life. And now, with Alexander by her side, they would face whatever came next together. The room was thick with tension as Claire stood her ground, her mother's icy gaze fixed upon her. It was the first time in years that Claire had truly confronted her family, the first time she had stood up for herself, not out of anger, but out of necessity. "You think you can just throw away everything we've built?" Her mother's voice was sharp, almost cold, as she stood up from her seat. "Do you think I wanted any of this? To force you into a marriage?" Claire's heart pounded in her chest, but she refused to back down. "I never wanted this," Claire said, her voice steady. "And I won't live this life any longer. I will not be a pawn in your games, and I will not pretend to be someone I'm not. I'm done living for you, for the family." Her mother looked as if she had been slapped, and for a moment there was a flicker of vulnerability in her eyes. But then her face hardened again, her jaw clenched. "You're a fool, Claire," her mother spat. You're throwing away everything. The family's future, the legacy. You think you can walk away from all of this? Claire's heart ached, but she remained resolute. I'm not walking away from anything, she replied. I'm choosing a life that's my own, and I'm not going to let anyone, least of all you, dictate what that looks like. Her mother's eyes narrowed. So, you're going to choose that man, the one who's been in a coma for months? You'll throw everything away for him? Claire's pulse quickened at her mother's words. She had always been the one to sacrifice, to live according to the family's rules. But now, she wasn't sure if Alexander even wanted her in that way. He had just woken up. He might be confused. He might not want to stay in the marriage either. But still, the thought of living her life any other way was unbearable. I'm not throwing anything away, Claire said, her voice unwavering. I'm finally choosing to live the life I deserve, a life where I can have a choice. Her mother stood silently for a long moment, eyes cold and calculating. She seemed to weigh her options, calculating her next move. You'll regret this, her mother finally said, her voice low. You'll regret walking away from everything. From us. No, Claire said firmly. I won't. I'm not going to regret finding my own path. As her mother turned to leave, Claire's heart beat faster. She had made her decision, and there was no turning back. But as her mother's footsteps faded down the hallway, Claire felt the weight of her family's expectations settle heavily on her shoulders. She knew the consequences wouldn't end with a few harsh words. She had set a chain of events in motion that couldn't be undone. But for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of relief. The truth was out. She had spoken up, and now she was free to choose her future. Later that day, Claire went to see Alexander. She had been avoiding him, afraid of how their relationship would change now that the truth had come to light. But when she entered his room, she saw him sitting up, his face still pale but determined. His eyes softened when he saw her, and he smiled faintly. Claire, he said, his voice rough but steady. I didn't think you'd come. Her heart ached at the sight of him. He had been in a coma for so long, and now that he was awake, things were so different. But they were both free now, in their own way. I had to come, Claire whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I had to tell you the truth. About everything. Alexander's gaze softened, and he motioned for her to sit beside him. As she did, he took her hand in his touch warm and steady. You don't have to explain anything to me, he said quietly. I understand. We've both been trapped in situations beyond our control, but we don't have to stay trapped anymore. Claire nodded, her heart swelling with a mixture of relief and uncertainty. I don't know what the future holds, Alexander, she said softly, but I know I want to figure it out. With you. Alexander smiled, his hand tightening around hers. Then let's figure it out together. No more secrets. No more pretending. The weight of the world seemed to lift off Claire's shoulders as she looked at him. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she was standing on solid ground. She wasn't sure what the future would look like, but one thing was certain, they would face it together. And that thought, that possibility, made all the difference. Days passed as Claire and Alexander began to slowly piece together their new reality. The mansion, once a symbol of her family's legacy and expectations, now felt more like a space for healing, filled with the quiet hum of their shared time together. Despite the relief Claire felt after confronting her mother, the storm was far from over. Her family had not taken her refusal to conform lightly. Word quickly spread that Claire had defied their wishes and had begun to live on her own terms. As expected, her mother was furious, and her father, ever the stoic businessman, had withdrawn his support, leaving Claire to deal with the fallout alone. But it was not just her family she had to worry about. The Ford family, tied to Alexander's business empire, was not as forgiving. News of Alexander's awakening brought with it a wave of attention, both from his family and business associates. Claire knew it was only a matter of time before they were forced to confront the consequences of their decisions. One afternoon, as Claire sat beside Alexander's bed, discussing their next steps, the door to his room opened, and a man in a tailored suit stepped inside. Claire's heart skipped a beat. She had never seen this man before. But there was something about the way he carried himself that screamed authority. Mr. Ford, the man said, nodding toward Alexander, I'm pleased to see you awake. Alexander looked up, his gaze narrowing slightly. Who are you? He asked, his voice still rough from the coma. The man offered a tight smile. "I'm Robert Walker," he said. "I work closely with the Ford family. And you, Mr. Ford, are in a precarious position. We need to discuss the future of the company." Claire's stomach twisted. She could feel the weight of the situation press down on her. She had hoped that once Alexander woke up, things would calm down. But instead, it felt like the storm was only just beginning. Alexander glanced at Claire, his brow furrowed. "What do you mean by that?" End of 7T. One of the Tumman 8. End of chapter 7, he asked, his tone more forceful now. Robert Walker stepped further into the room, his eyes flicking between Alexander and Claire. "The company is in a delicate position. Your absence has left a power vacuum, and your family's financial interests are at stake. There are people who are eager to take advantage of this situation." Claire could feel the tension building between them, but she remained silent, not knowing what to say. The man in front of them had the cold air of someone who saw everything as a transaction, not as a matter of personal lives. "So, what are you suggesting?" Alexander's voice was sharp. "You want me to get back to work immediately?" Robert nodded, his expression hardening. "Exactly. The company cannot afford to wait for a moment of weakness. We need you in control. Your family's assets are at risk, and it's time for you to step up." Claire's heart raced. This wasn't the future she had envisioned for them. She had hoped for a fresh start, free from the weight of the family expectations. But it seemed like the forces that had controlled their lives were already pushing them back into their old roles. Alexander seemed to consider this for a moment before shaking his head. "I'm not ready for this," he said, his voice quieter now. "And I'm not going to rush back into it just because you say so." Robert Walker's eyes narrowed. "You don't have a choice. This is bigger than you, Mr. Ford. This is about your family's legacy, and you have a responsibility to uphold it." Claire could feel her pulse quicken. She was starting to understand the gravity of the situation. Alexander wasn't just waking up to reclaim his life, he was waking up to a battle, one that would define the rest of his existence. "No," Alexander said, his voice firm. "I won't be controlled like this. I won't let anyone dictate my life or my decisions." Robert Walker's face darkened, but he didn't back down. "Very well," he said coldly. "But know this, your family is not going to sit by idly while you make these decisions. The pressure will only increase from here." As the man turned to leave, Claire's thoughts spun. The reality of the situation was sinking in. Alexander was awake, but the forces of his family and the business empire were relentless. It wasn't just a matter of choosing their future, they would have to fight for it. She looked at Alexander, and for the first time, she saw the full weight of the situation in his eyes. "We have a long road ahead," he said quietly, his voice low and filled with determination. Claire nodded, her hand finding his. "We'll face it together," she said softly, her resolve strengthening. She knew now that their journey was far from over. But at least they had each other. They had the strength to fight for the life they deserved, no matter what obstacles stood in their way. The days following Robert Walker's visit to the mansion were filled with an air of uncertainty and tension. Claire could feel the weight of the decision looming over them, the pressure mounting with every passing moment. Alexander, though resolute, seemed more withdrawn, consumed by thoughts of the family business and what it would mean for his future. He had been in a coma for so long, and now that he was awake, he had to face a world that had moved forward without him. Claire knew that the battle was just beginning. They had made it clear to Robert Walker and the Ford family that they would not be controlled. But she also knew that the people surrounding them would not back down easily. As the days passed, the reality of the situation hit Claire harder than ever. Alexander spent most of his time in meetings with his lawyer and business associates, trying to get a handle on the state of the Ford family empire. The weight of the company, the legacy, the expectations, it all rested on his shoulders, and he felt it. Claire, on the other hand, found herself spending more time alone, reflecting on the path she had chosen. She couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that no matter how hard she tried, her family would always try to pull her back into their world. She was still their daughter, and they were relentless in their attempts to control her every move. One morning, after a particularly grueling meeting with Robert, Alexander came to Claire with a look of determination in his eyes. "We can't keep running from this," he said, his voice firm but filled with a sense of urgency. It's time to confront my family, my entire legacy, and make a stand. I don't want to be their puppet anymore." Claire's heart raced at his words. She had always admired Alexander's strength, but this was different. This was a man who had been forced into a life he didn't choose, and now he was ready to take control of his destiny. She could see the fire in his eyes, the resolve that had been missing when he first woke up. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "What are you planning?" Alexander stepped closer to her, taking her hand in his. "We're going to the Ford family gathering, the one where they'll announce the new leadership in the company. We're going to show them that we're in control now, not them. I won't let them dictate our future any longer." Claire hesitated. She knew what this would mean, confronting her family, the people who had controlled her life for so long. But at the same time, she knew that this was their only chance to break free from the shackles that bound them. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Claire asked, her voice soft but filled with concern. "What if they try to tear us apart again? What if they don't accept us?" Alexander looked at her, his expression unwavering. "I've spent too long hiding from my family's expectations. I won't do it anymore. I've chosen you, Claire. I've chosen our future together." Claire's heart swelled with emotion. She had always dreamed of a life where she could choose for herself, where she could stand beside someone who loved her for who she was, not because of a family obligation. Now, it seemed that dream was finally within reach. The day of the Ford family gathering arrived. It was held at one of the family's grand estates, a place that Claire had grown up visiting as a child. The sprawling grounds, the opulent ballroom, it all felt so familiar, yet so foreign now. She wasn't the girl who had once dreamed of fitting in with her family's high society world. She was a woman who had fought for her freedom, and she wasn't about to let anyone take that away. As they arrived at the estate, Claire could feel the eyes of the family members on them, their gazes sharp and calculating. She knew they were wondering what she and Alexander were doing there, why they hadn't bowed to their demands. The moment they entered the ballroom, her mother locked eyes with her. The expression on her face was a mixture of disbelief and anger. But Claire didn't look away. She stood tall, holding Alexander's hand tightly, knowing that this was the moment that would define their future. Alexander stepped forward, his voice strong as he addressed the room. "I'm here today to make it clear that I am in control of my own life," he said, his words carrying weight. "I will not be manipulated by anyone. Not my family, not the company. I choose my own path, and I choose Claire to stand beside me." The room fell silent. Claire could feel the tension, the shock of those who had always held the power over her family's legacy. But she didn't flinch. She stood beside Alexander, her heart pounding with both fear and exhilaration. This was their moment. This was the moment they would finally take control of their destiny, together. The room was silent, the tension thick, as the Ford family members stood frozen in disbelief. Alexander had just made his declaration, the one that would forever change the course of their lives. His words hung in the air like a challenge, daring anyone to oppose him. Claire stood beside him, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it. This was the moment that would define their future. The whispers started almost immediately, the murmurs of disbelief and shock rippling through the crowd. Claire could see her mother's face, her expression a mixture of anger and confusion. For years, Claire had been the perfect daughter, following the family's expectations, living her life by their rules. And now, in front of all these people, she had chosen to defy them. "Alexander," her mother's voice cut through the silence, sharp and authoritative. "What is this nonsense? You think you can just take over everything? Destroy the legacy we've built?" Alexander turned to face his mother, his expression calm but unwavering. "No, Mother," he said firmly. "I'm not destroying anything. I'm taking control of my own life. The company, the legacy, it was never meant to be a cage. It was meant to be a tool, something that should have served us, not enslaved us." The room fell quiet again, the weight of his words sinking in. Claire could feel the eyes of the room on them, the judgment, the scrutiny. But she stood tall, her hand in Alexander's, knowing that this was the only way forward. She wasn't the young girl who had once been scared to speak her mind. She was a woman who had finally found her voice, who had found someone who would stand with her, not against her. "You don't understand, Alexander," her mother continued, her voice trembling with frustration. "You've never understood what it takes to keep this family together. You've always been too focused on your own desires. This company, this family, it's built on blood, sweat, and sacrifice. And now, you're throwing it all away. Claire felt a sharp pang of guilt in her chest. She had heard these words her entire life, and they still cut deep. But she knew now that she couldn't let the weight of her family's expectations control her any longer. She had to make her own decisions. She had to choose her own path. "No, Mother," Claire said quietly, her voice steady. "I'm not throwing anything away. I'm choosing the life I want, just as Alexander is choosing his. We're not going to live in a world where we are controlled by obligations and legacies that weren't our choice to begin with." Her mother stared at her, her eyes wide with disbelief. For a moment, Claire thought she might cry, but the tears didn't come. Instead, she felt a sense of peace wash over her, a sense of relief that she had finally spoken her truth. Alexander turned back to the room, his gaze sweeping over the other members of the Ford family. "This is not just about me," he said, his voice calm but filled with authority. "It's about all of us. We can choose to continue living in the past, following rules and traditions that no longer serve us, or we can create a new future. One where we are free to choose our own path, where we are free to make our own decisions." There was a long silence, the room so still it felt like time itself had stopped. Claire could see the family members exchanging looks, the uncertainty and doubt in their eyes. But no one spoke. It was clear that they were all waiting for something, waiting for someone to break the silence, to offer a solution, a way out. But no one did. Alexander's declaration had changed the course of the evening. It was no longer about maintaining the status quo. It was about change. And change was something no one in the room seemed ready for. After what felt like an eternity, Claire's mother finally spoke, her voice low and cold. "You think you can just walk away from all of this?" she asked, her gaze fixed firmly on Claire. "You'll never be part of this family again if you choose this." Claire's heart clenched, but she held her ground. "I don't need to be part of this family to have a future. I have Alexander, and together, we'll build something new, something of our own." The words hung in the air, and for the first time, Claire felt the full weight of her decision. She was letting go of everything she had ever known, everything her family had built, and choosing a new path, a path that would be uncertain, but one where she could finally be free. Alexander stood beside her, his hand still holding hers, and together, they faced the family that had tried to control them. For the first time, they were free to choose their own future. The days that followed the Ford family gathering were a mix of quiet reflection and action. Claire and Alexander knew their lives would never be the same. The storm they had weathered, the choices they had made, had forever altered the course of their future. Claire had finally stepped away from the expectations of her family, from the suffocating grip of tradition that had held her captive for so long. Alexander, too, had taken control of his own destiny, no longer allowing his family's business empire to dictate his every move. Together, they had made a pact to live for themselves, to build a future that was theirs and theirs alone. It wasn't going to be easy, they both knew that. The Ford family was not one to let go of control easily, and the business world they were a part of was unforgiving. But they had each other, and for the first time, that was enough. One evening, as Claire and Alexander sat in the cozy study of their new home, a space they had created for themselves, Alexander turned to Claire with a smile. "I never imagined we'd get here," he said, his voice soft. "I never thought I'd be free of all that." Claire smiled back, her heart light for the first time in so long. "Neither did I," she replied. "But we did it, together." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of the past and the uncertainty of the future hanging in the air. But it wasn't a burden anymore. It was a new beginning. Alexander took Claire's hand in his gaze intense but warm. "I want to make a life with you, Claire, a real one, not one dictated by anyone else's expectations or obligations." Claire's heart swelled as she looked at him. This was the man she had always hoped to find, the one who would see her for who she truly was and love her, not for her family's wealth or her position, but for her heart. "I want that too," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I want a life where we're free to choose our own path, where we make our own decisions, a life where we don't have to answer to anyone but ourselves." The days turned into weeks, and soon, Claire and Alexander began to rebuild their lives. They were no longer trapped by the expectations of their families or the business world. Instead, they focused on what truly mattered each other and the life they wanted to create. They worked together, not just on the company, but on their relationship, ensuring that they never lost sight of the bond they had forged through their struggles. Slowly, but surely, the Ford family business began to evolve. Alexander took a more hands-on approach, ensuring that decisions were made based on what was best for everyone involved, not just for the family's legacy. Claire, too, found her voice in the business world, making her own mark, and proving that she was more than just a product of her family's wealth. It wasn't without its challenges. There were moments when the weight of the past threatened to pull them back, when the expectations of their families and the demands of the business world seemed too much to bear. But with each challenge, they grew stronger, more united in their resolve. They knew that they had built something special, something that could never be taken from them. One day, as Claire and Alexander stood on the balcony of their home, looking out at the city below, Alexander turned to Claire with a thoughtful expression. "We've come a long way," he said, his voice filled with a quiet pride. "I'm proud of what we've built, proud of you." Claire smiled, her heart full. "I'm proud of us," she replied. "We've built something real, something that's ours." As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the horizon, they stood there together, hand in hand, knowing that whatever the future held, they would face it side by side. No longer bound by the expectations of others, they had created their own destiny, and that, in the end, was all that mattered. In this captivating tale of transformation, Claire and Alexander navigate the complex world of family expectations, legacy, and true love in one of the most inspiring millionaire stories. As Claire finds herself forced into a marriage she never chose, the story takes a dramatic turn when Alexander wakes from a coma, revealing the truth and reclaiming his own future. In these millionaire stories, the protagonists fight against the powerful forces trying to control them, seeking freedom and a life they can call their own. Claire and Alexander's journey is filled with challenges, from facing family betrayal to taking control of their shared destiny, all while dealing with the weight of their family's empire. Through love, determination, and a deep desire to live authentically, they defy the odds. As the plot unfolds in these millionaire stories, Claire learns the true value of standing up for herself, building a life based on her own terms, not the ones imposed by others. The couple faces obstacles but discovers that together, they can create a future full of hope and opportunity. This series of millionaire stories is not just about wealth, but about personal empowerment, finding love against all odds, and breaking free from societal expectations. The powerful narrative continues to unfold as Claire and Alexander fight for their happiness, their freedom, and a future where they call the shots, proving that even in the most opulent millionaire stories, true love and authenticity can triumph over control and manipulation.